Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here so early today. And by being here early today, you've shown incredible wisdom, because this session is definitely one not to be missed. The Second World War was a war during which air power came into its own. Developed in the skies above the Western Front during World War I, air power in World War II was faster and deadlier. Indeed, the Second World War became a conflict that was dominated by what was done in the skies above the battlefield. Both in combat and in overall production, records were set during World War II that remain remarkable to this very day, which is why we're here to study the subject. In production, one record that remains amazing is the greatest aircraft manufacturing industrial production in human history, which was the manufacturing of the B-24 bomber. Over 16,000 of these were produced during World War II, and it's the most produced aircraft in human history, something that was only made possible by American industrial production. But then in combat, for bombers, for fighter pilots, for troop carrier pilots, World War II was a conflict of incredible intensity and, in some cases, terrible brutality. Seated on this stage today are 5 of the most senior aviators you will ever see in one place. 5 individuals who flew during the Second World War and distinguished themselves on 3 sides. I'm going to introduce them all very briefly for you now. Seated close to me, Colonel Richard Candelaria, United States Air Force. Next to him is Joachim Hoehne, who flew in the Luftwaffe during World War II. Next to Mr. Hoehne is Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bourgeois, who had the distinction of flying in a little squadron called VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, United States Marine Corps. Next to Mr. Bourgeois is Colonel Charles McGee, United States Air Force. And then at the end of the table, Zinji Abe, who flew for the Japanese Imperial Navy, flying off the aircraft carriers Akagi and then later Junyo.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zenji Abe. I'm very much pleased and also honored with this opportunity. I speak about the air attack power.
Abe-san was the pilot of a Japanese D-3A1 Aiki dive bomber, what Americans called the VAL, and he flew during the second wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, but he flew in other battles in the Pacific War as well. We'll hear more about that in a second. At this stage, though, I'm going to ask each of our 5 panelists to share a little bit about their experiences as a pilot, as an aviator in World War II, and we're going to begin on this end of the table. And Mr. Candelaria, or I should say Colonel Candelaria, excuse me, in approximately 5 minutes or so, could you please tell us a little bit about what you experienced in the air during World War II? You can do it right there from your seat.
Oh, very well. My squadron and my group were stationed in England, in RAF Watersham, England. And our first mission was flown on the 6th, it was the 7th of May of 1944, just before D-Day. At that time, we had P-38 Lockheed Lightnings. They were twin-engine fighters. Later on that year, we converted to the P-51 Mustang, in which we got most of our victories. Our squadron did extremely well. We destroyed over 47 aircraft in less than 6 months. And I don't know anything about the Pacific area, but I can tell you that in the European area, the 8th Air Force did a lot of damage. And some people may say that air power can't win a war, but I can tell you that we can sure make it tough for the enemy to continue to fight. And I think that some will agree that no, we can't take any ground because we're flying above it, but we can sure help the ground troops get to their objective. I was very fortunate to become an ace. I was the only ace of my squadron, but others shot down almost 5, but you have to have 5 or more in order to become an ace. And I was fortunate enough. My first 2 kills were Focke-Wulf 190s, and there were approximately 82, so many of them got away. The next time I had a combat where I could actually shoot, because at the very beginning, you fly wing, that is, the leader does the shooting. You just watch his tail and make sure nobody gets there and shoots him down. And I was fortunate enough to wind up in a position where I was able to save my leader. However, on one mission I was alone because of bad weather and a small maintenance problem. I took off last, but I did get to the rendezvous point with the bombers first. And we were escorting at that time to Berlin that particular day. When I got to the bomber box that we were supposed to escort, I was still alone, and I saw 2 Me-262s. These are Messerschmitt twin-engine jet fighters, and of course, you know, they could leave us behind. However, I was above them, so I was able to intercept them and disperse them, and I did, I believe that I shot one of them down, but I couldn't prove it because he went into the clouds trailing smoke and fire, but he could have pulled out, so I couldn't claim him as a confirmed kill. However, about that time, about 15 to 16 Me-109s, these were single-engine fighters, Messerschmitts, attacked the formation. I was lucky enough to be there and have altitude on them, and I engaged the leader, who gave me a terrible time. He could make that Messerschmitt sing, recite poetry, dance, and play a violin while he was flying it. And for a while I was sure he was going to get me, but I got lucky and I hit him, and he started going down, and with the others trailing behind us, they couldn't really get at me because I was so close to him at all times that if they tried to shoot at me, they'd hit him, although I did see some 20-millimeter shells that came out of that nose. He could probably tell you more about it than I can, but it's scary because it looks like a glowing golf ball. At any rate, I was able to shoot down 3 more, so that gave me 4 kills and 1 probable for that day. And of course, with the other kills that I had, it made me an ace. And about that time, I was joined by some of the squadron, and they came down and they saw the latter part of the action because they saw explosions and flames, and they were able to pick me out. They were trying to find me because I kept telling them they ought to come and join the fun. But I really didn't mean it that way. But anyway, I was sure I was doing about 5 quick laps around the beads all the time. So at any rate, they came and they were able to confirm because they saw the crashed aircraft that were burning on the ground, and obviously they were killed. So I did get a confirmation. We went on to the target, and at the target, I turned around and headed back home with some of my flight with me. Since I had dropped my external tanks, I jettisoned them in order to tangle with the jets. I had less fuel than most of the others. However, that was a big day for us. Another Me-262 was shot down by our squadron, Captain Hooker. shot one down, and there were several 109s, and I believe one more Focke-Wulf 190 as well, but I can't remember all of the claims that were made by the group. At any rate, our main mission was the escort of the heavy bombers to get them to go to their target and home, and we had the range to go with them wherever they went. We went to Czechoslovakia, we went to the edge of the Russian border. Wherever the bombers went, we went with them. And I have a great deal of respect for all bomber pilots, because if you could have seen them coming home, 2 engines missing, half a tail gone, pieces of wing, and they were just chapaka, chapaka, chapaka going home. And we would pick up the strays and try to herd them together to give them escort, because the escort mission would have to go with the main force. You had to protect the largest number of bombers, so the strays were left behind to fend for themselves. And the Focke-Wulf 190s would be climbing up, waiting for us to leave so that they could go down and pick off the strays. So sometimes we would go back and pick up the strays and herd them home. So that's how I gained a great deal of respect and admiration for any bomber crew that was out there in the European theater. I know nothing about the Pacific. Just a bit of trivia, the very first ace was a Navy ace, darn it. His name was Donald Lopez, and he was in the Navy. He shot down, he became the first ace of World War II. And Oscar Perdomo shot down he became the last ace of World War II. He was in a P-47, he was U.S. Air Force, or U.S. Army Air Forces. He was based at Okinawa. At any rate, the first and the last, Lopez and Perdomo, and a whole bunch in between. I'm quite proud of being an ace for this reason. You know, if you shoot someone down, why, you've paid for your training. If you shoot down 2, you pay for all the ones you pranged on the runway or in taxiing or something. And the third one, well, now you've paid for your keep. The fourth one, luck. The fifth one, definitely lots of luck. So if you're lucky enough to be an ace, you can say, I can thank the good Lord that he made me an ace. By the way, of all of the aces that were shot down in Europe, again, I know nothing about the Pacific, that were shot down in Europe, only one was shot down by an enemy aircraft. There was a Focke-Wulf 190. All the rest were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, or flak as we called it. I was shot down by flak, so I know what it's like. But his name is Chuck Yeager, and you probably have all heard of him. He was the only ace shot down by an enemy aircraft. All the rest were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, friendly, unfriendly, well, all fire. There's no such thing as friendly fire. It's all unfriendly if it hits you. Thank you.
Okay, 2 comments. First of all, I think he deserves a round of applause for telling about all those dogfights without doing any of this, which is normally what you see pilots doing, so that's definitely something to reward you for. But then, Colonel Candelaria, one quick question. What did you like better, P-38 or P-51 Mustang?
My first love was a P-38. That's all I ever wanted to fly. But my last and the big love was a P-51 Mustang. You could outfight anything, excuse me, we could outfight anything and everything that flew, if you played it right, if you did the right things.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Mr. Heine, if you wouldn't mind, sir, could you please, in just a few minutes, share a little bit about your experiences in flying for the Luftwaffe during World War II?
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joachim Mahoney. I was born and raised in a strict military family because my dad used to be a fighter pilot in World War I with Richthofen, Bölke, and Böhme. And even Hermann Goering, I had to meet and shake hands with him as a little boy, which I didn't like him in the first time I met him. Well, I grew up on the air base in close to a medieval town where you got your Grimm's fairy tales from Snow White and Hansel and Gretel and all this. Anyway, there on that base there, I was the only son of the commander, and naturally I had a free roaming. I flew with all kinds of airplanes, with the Junkers 52, Heinkel 111, most of the bombers there. They always gave me a ride because maybe they were getting a day off them from my father, you know, they could go home on vacation a little bit. So they did a little brown nosing. Then as things got bad, we young ones, we were about 50, I was 15 years old. We had to join the service as Flakhelfer. Now, a Flakhelfer, a flak really what means in a German, they love to make those mile-long words. Actually, that flak is a Flugabwehrkanone. Now that's even too much for a German soldier or German, so they call it a flak. Now, if anybody gives you a flak, you know he's not doing, liking you or is doing well for you, you know, so he wants to shoot on you. So I spent about a year as a flak helper, and then I volunteered as a glider pilot. And with 16, I flew my first gliders, but we were training on a fast landing, dead stick landings. And dead stick landing, once you're down on the ground, that's it. You better find a place to stop or lay it on the wing and go around like a little, or in circles with that airplane. What really happened was then after I made all several rings, I proudly fastened to my little uniform, blue uniform, and I was commanded over to Sprottau, which was on the east side of Germany, and started to train on a 163 rocket plane. Now that was the first time these planes came in action, and you had no brakes. In fact, when you took off, you had to drop your wheels, and you had to land on a skid, and that's where all the glider training came in. And believe me, the first time I was going there by myself, I had more butterflies than elephants in that thing. You sit there between two fuel tanks. If your rocket engine quits on the way up, it'll blow up on you. So you couldn't get out with the parachute. It went fine. I dropped my wheels, came down for a landing, put my skid out. And again, if you don't put the skid out, it'll bust your back. Well, I put the skid out, and then I did a good landing and got a little pat on the back. Till a couple of days later, I was supposed to go for another flight. Well, our instructors, they like to party once in a while, and they partied that night before. And so the crew didn't know that. They filled up, the first plane that goes up in the morning has full tanks. And since the instructor, he didn't want to fly. He had a hangover. So I had to climb in that thing, and I fired up that engine back there, and it jerks you back, and then I dropped my gear, and then you pull the stick back, and you climb straight up, till your engine quits. Well, mine didn't quit. I didn't know. I thought I had half tank full. I had full tanks. So I was up there, and I had no guns on this thing. This was a train, a 163, and they call it the Stummelhabicht on top of that. And I was getting out of oxygen. I'm running out of oxygen. Altitude, I had plenty, so I just set that thing back on the nose and came down with high speed. That airplane was already built for breaking the sound barrier. In fact, some of them did, and they lost their tail back there, but then they had to get out. So I came in for a landing, and I was sweating, regardless, it was cold, but I was sweating. As I set it in for on the grass. Now, for all things, the grass was wet. Now, you had no brakes on that thing. So I knew on the end of our grass runway, there was a deep ditch. So all I did, I just go ahead and ground looped it. So I didn't want to hit the ditch. So if I would have hit the ditch, it would explode, that thing. Mm-hmm. So they got me out of it, and they wanted to find out if I was still alive and how well I came through that mess. And that was the end of my flying as a fighter pilot, because meanwhile the Russians were knocking on the door. We were on the East Front with our Me-163s, and of course we were picking up, like he said, those stragglers on the way to Russia or Romania. We were supposed to get those bombers there. Well, it didn't come to all that anymore. The Russians took over, and I had to run up to Peenemünde with our battalion, and we had to hold the Russians back there so that Werner von Braun and all the rocket stuff and all his mechanics and parts can go west to Denmark. We had to hold the Russians in a winter of 45 and snow and ice, and with some sorry old French guns we had them finally, and I got out of that too. And I still believe in guardian angels, because in the last train out, I was arrested close, about 20 miles north of Dresden, and by the German MP, because some of my papers were mixed up, so they put me in the clink. So I didn't mind. I finally had a good place to sleep. We got a meal. But that night, it was at 13th of February, that night they bombed Dresden, and so that's why I knew I had guardian angels, because that train would have probably stopped right downtown Dresden, and I wouldn't be here. So anyway, I came out of that one, and then they called us Air Force Infantry, and we got over to the Autobahn in South Germany, and we were trying to stop Patton and his tanks and everything. It didn't work out too well neither. So I ended up as a prisoner of war, all in one piece. And I thank the Lord for that still today. And after my time in a war camp, which I used my English, what I had to learn in high school. See, in our high school, you had to have 2 foreign languages. I took Latin and English. And we were reading already, when we were about 11 or 12 years old, we were reading Rudyard Kipling, The Jungle Book, in English. And I read, well, you know, in those days there was no television. The radio was full of propaganda and Wagner music, which I still don't like Wagner today. I'm more for Mozart. Really, I can't stand him. Because after the war, I studied a little bit music. Anyway, when I came home, I was completely, how should I say, I was devastated. I mean, there was no future for me and nothing I couldn't see. Germany was all bombed and destroyed. And I met an engineer in a camp, and we used the same tent. And he told me, why in the world don't you become an engineer? Look, here's an opportunity for you. So, but before you can become an engineer in Germany, you have to, you have to go learn a trade, either as bricklayer, concrete finisher, or carpenter, again. And so that takes 3 years. But in wintertime, I used to go to engineering school, and I finally got my engineer. Meanwhile, my mother divorced, or my father divorced my mother. I don't know, I didn't get in a mess there. And she went to Houston because one of my uncles, he was a professor in Germany, but that was our southern part of our family were all Catholics, and he wrote some bad papers about Hitler. So he had to leave in a hurry and ended up in Houston. My mother came then to Houston, And I didn't want to go, and I didn't want to go to the United States, and I had nothing to do over here. What in the heck I want to go over there for? Well, she begging me, and so I said, well, okay. I finally got my papers, and it wasn't that easy because the American consul, he looked at my war record, and I was a Nazi leader there, a Hitler Youth leader, because I was the bigger one and I knew how to box and beat him up better, you know. So. Anyway, I got here to the States, and the second day I had to go to work already as an engineer in Galveston for the big company out of Houston, Farnsworth and Chambers. And believe me, when you're a little European, how should I say, civilian there or working over there, Europe and Germany is a little bit different. It's a little bit better organized. It's a little more, the law is enforced. And when I came here and had a crew out there in Galveston, they were half black and then half Mexican and some other rowdies in there. It wasn't easy for me to make them listen to me and do what I want them to do. But it took about only 4 weeks, and we all became friends. And then I also had on the other side some ex-American soldiers who was fighting in Germany, and they resented me too. Well, we all got in Galveston in a bar one Saturday night and got drunk. And from then on, we were all one big old family, and we finished it.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's not every day that you get to hear from a German rocket plane pilot. So that's an interesting thing to sit and listen to. It continues to fascinate me as a student of history to this very day to study the way that German engineers and scientists perfected aviation in the years leading up to the Second World War and then during the war. Of course, they reached so many incredible milestones with their production of piston-driven aircraft, particularly fighters in the Focke-Wulf 190, the Me-109 Messerschmitt. Absolutely incredible aircraft. And then the fact that before the war ended, they were capable of deploying the Me-262 jet fighter and, of course, the Messerschmitt 163 rocket fighter. It certainly demonstrates how the Germans reached their own aviation milestones in World War II. Well, shifting now from the European theater of the war around to the other side of the globe, let's hear from Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bourgeois, U.S. Marine Corps. Mr. Bourgeois, could you please tell us a little bit about what it was like to fly in the famous VMF 214 Black Sheep Squadron with Gregory Bowington?
Yes, yeah, good morning. I was born and raised in New Orleans and went to St. Aloysius High School and then to LSU. Best thing that happened to me was the war started because I was failing at LSU and I'm sure they're going to kick me out. But I got my first flight in an airplane when I was 7 years old. My father, Louis I. Bourgeois, and the Young Men Business Club arranged for airmail to come to New Orleans from Houston. And when the first flight arrived at Callender Airfield south of New Orleans, we all went down to see the airplane. And the pilot took the men up every once in a while for a short ride, and there was always a little room in that cockpit for a little 7-year-old boy. And I fell in love with airplanes. After going through flight school at NAS Corpus Christi and being designated second lieutenant in the Marine Corps and to fight a school in San Diego, we were sent overseas as replacement pilots. And Major Greg Pappy Boynton was the senior officer of the 13 pilots that were sent over there. And I remember meeting him and liking him immediately because he liked to tip a few, as I did too at that time. And he was taking I'll never forget, he was taking a case of scotch to some friend over in the islands there. And about 2 days out of San Diego, we tipped the first bottle. And then it was pretty well gone by the time we got over there. But he and I got along because I liked to play bridge and he liked to play bridge. And we had many sessions when there was nothing else to do. And this was we arrived in the Pacific Theater in January 1943, and you went into a fighter pool as a replacement pilot. And he and I were assigned to VMF 122. He was an executive officer, and I was a brand new young pilot that didn't know anything. And I didn't really get to fly any missions there except two. We were flying F-4F Wildcats, and we had two airplanes that were photo reconnaissance models, and they let me fly this, doing some photographs over Munda, on New Georgia Island, where the Marines were going to land in a few weeks. And to fly this mission, you flew at about 2,000 feet and it held a certain speed. You couldn't maneuver anything, and you just got shot at from the ground. Came back with lots of holes in the airplane. Eventually, Boynton broke his leg in a brawl fight and was sent to New Zealand to recover. And when he came back from New Zealand, they were looking for a squadron commander to take over VMF 214. And he was designated that commanding officer, and he picked 28 pilots out of the pool, and 8 of us were combat veterans and the rest were brand new. And we were issued, well, we'd been flying Corsairs, and in those days, you didn't get a personal Corsair. You flew whatever Corsair was available when you were assigned to a mission. And we flew out of Guadalcanal at first and then moved up to Munda Air Base on the New Georgia Island, which was close to the Japanese base in Bougainville. I remember one mission that we were escorting Marine SBD dive bombers. There were 18 of them, and we put 16 Corsairs in the air for air support. I was flying in one division in close air support. The bombers were about 7,000 feet. The low cover was just off to the one side or the other, and the other 16 Corsairs, 8 Corsairs were flying at about 1,000 feet above us. As we approached, the target was the shipping in the base there on Bougainville. And as we approached there, you could see this huge thunderstorm right over the base. And the mission commander decided that he couldn't attack there and decided to attack the airfield. And the bombers, when they started the pushover, were right on the edge of the thunderstorm. And about that same time, pick any number of Japanese Zero airplanes you want to attack us. And we took them on. And we tried to go down with the dive bombers to protect them, but eventually it ended up being shot at, and I saw traces going by my wing and pulled into the clouds there and climbed back up a little bit and came out, looked around, and there was a Zero right in front of me. And I blasted him down and went back in the clouds because somebody else was shooting at me, did this a second time and came out and shot another Zero down. Went back into the clouds, and when I came out the third time, and dogfights quickly spread all over the area, and there was nobody around. I couldn't see another single airplane. So I decided I'm going to fly back to my base at Munda, and I'm going along kind of slow, not slow, but not paying attention too much. And all of a sudden, traces are coming over my wing. And I looked back, and there was a Zero sneaking up on me in the back. And I went to full power, closed all the cowling flaps and the oil flaps to get as much speed as possible. And Corsair, if you dove, you could supposedly outrun the Zero. Well, I couldn't outrun this. I just didn't have the proper power. I finally realized he was getting closer, and I was shooting more and that I was going to have to turn and fight him. And I was about ready to turn and try and do something, otherwise I'd be shot down. And he pulled up and left. And really surprised me. So I finally got to the base, no problem at all. After the war, after I retired from the Marine Corps, I went to work for an aerospace division of the Singer Company. And they had a subsidiary in Japan called Mitsubishi Precision. And my boss sent me over there to help them in planning how to market the gyros and navigation systems that my division built. The vice president of marketing in this company over there was a retired Japanese pilot by the name of Suo Moda. And he and I became very friendly because we had things in common, like he liked to hunt, I liked to hunt. And in Japan at that time, very, very few people had the privilege of, hunting birds and ducks and things. We got to talking about what we'd done in the past, and we talked about, World War II and the Allies. I told him I'd been in the Solomons, and he said, well, I was in the Solomons. I was commanding this squadron on Bougainville. And I said, well, I'm relating my experiences. He says, I think we better check our logbooks. So he came to the United States a couple of weeks later, and he brought his logbook, and I got my logbook out, and sure enough, this was the guy trying to shoot me down. And so we got along. He brought me a custom-made shotgun, which was a beauty. And so I took him hunting on the eastern shore of Maryland, and we had one of those days where the birds came in low and slow, and he got his limit in the morning, we got another limit in the afternoon, and we went back to the hotel to have a final dinner together. And after dinner there, we're sipping some wine and stuff, and he sits up and he says, Henry, I'm sure glad to hell I didn't shoot you down. There were many successful squadrons in the Pacific, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. But one of the famous was VMF 214 Black Sheep. Pappy Boynton, I'm sure you heard a lot about, was commanding officer. And we had some great fights in air to air. And the squadron in their I think it was about 6 weeks, shot down about 96 Japanese airplanes. Boynton shot down 22 of them, and he had 6 before in the Flying Tigers, so he was the leading Marine ace in World War II with 28 kills. He was shot down in January and picked up by a Japanese submarine, eventually went to Japan as a prisoner of war. And he was released after the war and came back to the States. I'll never forget when we were having the first squadron meetings when the squadron was organized, and we were talking about all kinds of things. And he said, if I'm ever missing, he says, don't worry about me. He says, because after the war, I'll meet you in a bar in San Diego and we'll celebrate. And sure enough, after the war, when they released him, they flew to San Francisco, and Chance Vaught, who built the Corsairs that we flew, sponsored a 3-day drunken dinner, and Boynton was there, and I still have a hangover from that dinner there. In VMF 122, we had a lot of successes, and there was one interesting thing I'd like to tell you about. We were scrambled to intercept Japanese bombers coming down to sink the Marine landing on Munda into shipping. And the weather was one of these terrible days like we have in New Orleans with rain and thunderstorms. And we took off. I was flying the second section of a 4-plane division. And we were about halfway there, and my wingman radioed that he was having engine problems, and he had to turn back and go back to Guadalcanal. And he turned, and I lost him in the clouds. And I let down, it's below the clouds, which was about 400 feet, 400 or 500 feet. I never could see him again, and we never know what happened to him. And then I was kind of lost, not sure what to do. Decided maybe I'd better go back to Guadalcanal, and I headed in a direction I thought was Guadalcanal. And I'm flying alone, and I saw some Marine dive bombers, a flight of 9 over on one side, and I said, hey, these guys have got to know where they're going. I'll join up on them. And so I did, and we flew along and flew along. And finally, they split, and the leader and the first 4 SBDs went to the right, and the others went to the left. And I said, well, I better stick with the leader. He sure knows what he's doing. Well, he didn't really. And we flew, and we ended up on an island called Renel. It was about 100 miles south of Guadalcanal. And we had strip maps of the Solomon Islands, but the Renel was not on it. I had no idea where I was, and my radio didn't work. And we circled the Renel, which had a lagoon in the middle, for a while, and pretty soon the SBD pilots went down and landed in the lagoon in the water. And I said, well, I guess I'm going to do the same thing. Now, you got to remember, I'm 21, I'm scared as hell, I don't know what I'm doing. But I made a water landing, and this Corsair was supposed to float for a little bit, but it went straight down to the bottom. And I got out of there, I stood on my life raft, and it went down with the airplane. Here, imagine now, you're dressed you're carrying a sidearm, you got a belt around you with a water can, and medical stuff and other things. You got heavy boots on and stuff, and I'm floundering around in this water in the lagoon, and wondering if there are sharks in there or what. And pretty soon a native boat came out and picked me up, and they took me ashore. And it was now late in the afternoon. It was rainy, misty, cold, and nasty. And they put me in a little lean-to. I couldn't communicate with these people. They had their own language. But they brought me a little bowl of rice, and I slept the night as best I could. In the morning, they had lashed 2 canoes together with a platform on it, and 4 big natives there said, come on, let's get aboard. And we paddled down someplace and ended up at the main island village, which was at the end of the lagoon. And there, the chief could speak some pretty good English, because the English minister had been in the islands there. And they treated me, I was the first one to arrive. And the chief says, are you number 1? Well, I didn't know what he meant. I said, yeah, I'm number 1. So I got to sleep in his hut, which was really a house that night and his daughter was right next to me, so it was kind of nice. The next morning, the other pilots and crew started to arrive, but before they did, 2 or 3 big natives came and took me by the arms and dragged me down to the shore, and I didn't know what they wanted, but I went with them anyway. And they put me in a little canoe, and we paddled out to an island in the lagoon with all these palmetto trees and coconut trees, and we went through the bushes and came to a lean-to, and there was a woman laying there, and she had an attendant, another woman, and they pointed at her and they pointed at me like, do something. I didn't know what to do, and so I knelt down, and obviously she was pregnant, and I put my hand on her belly and on her head like I knew what I was doing, and I had some aspirin in my first aid kit, so I gave the aspirin to the attendant, and I said, give her 1, and whatever I could get through to them. It wasn't. So everybody was happy, and we went back to the chief's village, and that day they'd caught a big fish in the ocean and brought it in, and they baked it, and we had a good time. The next morning, the Navy and the Marines finally figured out where all these dumb pilots were, and they sent a PBY down to look for us, and we signaled the airplane. It landed in the lagoon to pick us up, and aboard the airplane was a Navy corpsman. And I told him about this lady out there who's pregnant, and maybe, you know, they ought to do something about it. So he went out and looked, and he came back and said, yeah, she is really pregnant and way overdue. The next day, well, they took us off and flew back to Guadalcanal. The next day, the Navy flew some doctors down, and they took the baby, made sure it got born, it was healthy and all that then. And when they came back, the chief had sent some ceremonial sticks along that were all carved with American Marines and all that stuff in it. And they told me that the chief was really happy that I'd done something for his wife, and that they had named the boy WWII. And
That's fair. Well,
ever since then, I've been known as Doc Boo.
Well, thank you for that account, Doc Boo. One quick question before we move on. What'd you like better, the F4U Corsair or the F4F Wildcat?
Oh, the Corsair, I'll tell you, I can remember the first time I flew the Corsair. I'd never seen the airplane before, but you sit in it, and it's got this great big 2800 or engine with about 2,000 horsepower, and you push a throttle forward, and it's just like being accelerated with a rocket. It's fast, it was strong, it had 6 50 caliber machine guns that were all aligned to hit at about 150 yards in front of the airplane. And if you hit a Japanese airplane, it just tore it all apart, because they had incendiary rounds, they had armor piercing and explosive rounds. And as long as you could, bore sight on a Japanese airplane, which are very fragile, they had no self-sealing tanks or armor plate. You just absolutely destroyed them. And also, the Black Sheep Squadron did a lot of missions on the ground, strafing airfields, landing boats, shipping, and all that stuff. And if you get 2 or 3 Corsairs in a line coming in one behind the other, you could destroy anything. It was just a super airplane. I flew them for most of my first, up until the Korean War, and I have about 350 hours in the airplane. 2 years ago, I was at an air show in Indianapolis, and there was an airline pilot who had restored a Corsair, just like the ones we flew. And he had put a jump seat behind the pilot and took out the armor plate and whatever's back there. And he took me up for a ride. I'll tell you, what a thrill that was to sit in that airplane and hear that engine rev up and zoom down the runway to take off. So I could fly it again today if they'd give me one.
Well, pivoting now back from the Pacific War, it's often, I think, forgotten that the Marine Corps contributed fighter, bomber, patrol, and transport squadrons to the war, and they all did their part, just as VMF 214 did, Mr. Bourgeois did. Now moving on to our next extremely experienced aviator, Colonel Charles McGee, who flew not just in World War II, but maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about that. Colonel McGee?
Good morning, all. Thank you. Good to be here to talk to you about the black experience in aviation, military aviation. Colonel Candelara spoke of the 8th Air Force activity, which was out of England. The black experience would be out of 12th and 15th Air Force, flying from the southern part of Germany, but flying from France all the way over to the Romanian oil fields. I'll talk about segregation tomorrow, but today I will talk about what was accomplished, and we'd have to do that in 2 phases, because the first authorization by the Army Air Corps was for 1 pursuit squadron, which was the 99th Pursuit Squadron, and they would fly P-40 aircraft. They were trained, and the 99th went eventually to North Africa, supporting the push of the German army out of Rommel out of North Africa and then up the boot of Italy, moving into Sicily and then into Italy. The 99th flew for 12th Air Force more than 2,500 sorties in their support work. As you know, during the war, Pantelleria surrendered without any ground troops going to the island. Then they moved into Sicily, and as the Germans were pushed out of Sicily into southern Italy and then slowly up the boot of Italy on to the war's end. Contrary to some stories that we always got hand-me-down aircraft, the 99th got brand new P-40 when they arrived in North Africa. Well, behind the 99th, there were 3 more fighter squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, that became the 332nd Fighter Group. We were trained in the P-40, and then they said, your mission is going to change. You're going to do patrol work with the P-39 Bel Air Cobra. We did a little additional formation and gunnery, but still left the States on schedule in December of '43, going directly to Italy, flying harbor and coastal patrol. Now, the 99th was attached to white groups, and they were doing the interdiction work as the ground support moved northward up the peninsula of Italy. The 332nd group was doing the harbor and coastal patrol out of the Naples area. It was about the April time frame, as was mentioned, the bombers destroying Germany's war-making potential were suffering extremely high losses as they were now flying out of Italy, and so they were flying deeper into the German protected areas, and the losses in some cases over the targets was more than 50% of the bombers. So 15th Air Force was formed to provide fighter escort for our B-17s and B-24s, and of the 4 groups picked to begin that escort work, the 332nd Fighter Group was one of those groups picked. So in combat, we dropped the P-39s. In fact, we gave them to the Russians in their support, ground support work, and received the P-47 Thunderbolt and began moving from the Naples area of Italy to the Adriatic side, where we'd be closer to joining up with the bombers and closer to the target areas that we would be covering. And we started that work with 15th Air Force, as I say, with the P-47 Thunderbolt. And through the period, we flew more than 1,500 missions, rather, which a mission is assigned to a squadron, but each squadron would put up 16 aircraft. So there's many sorties involved when we say one mission. So in those some 1,500 missions total fighting for 12th and 15th Air Force, there were more than 15,000 sorties. But we only had the P-47 doing that strategic escort work for a couple of months, and the famed P-51 Mustang became available, and all of the escort groups received the P-51 Mustang, which is, if you ask an old fighter pilot, what do you like? I'd always say, well, the 51 Mustang was great for the work that we were doing because it was a maneuverable aircraft from the ground to 35,000 feet, and it had the speed and range that was above the other aircraft available at the time. Interesting in our experience, when we got the P-51 in early July of 1944, the powers to be decided to move the 99th from their tactical work and assign them to the 332nd Fighter Group. So the 332nd had the largest group fighter force, 415th Air Force, from that July 44 on through the end of the war in 45. In fact, one of the stories of the experience, there are a couple, when we had the P-47 returning from a bomber mission, returning to base, we often were given free exercise to attack other targets if we had the fuel and so on, and the flight of the P-47s sank a destroyer-type vessel in Trieste Harbor just with their machine gun fire. And fortunately, they had the gun film to prove that it was done without bombs. But as was said, well bore-sighted, that's the advantage of the P-47. It had 8 guns, and when you bore sight them well, you put a lot of lead in a small hole out there in front of you, and it did the job. The other experience, late in the war, I had come home and became a twin-engine pilot in program, but that's another story. They speak of the great train robbery. Well, it happened that the mission called for a long range, and it was going to be to Berlin. And the operations officer spoke to his lineman and wanted to know how many aircraft have the large tanks on them. Normally, we carried a 75-gallon, I believe, fuel tank, but there were also 110-gallon tanks available. And the crewman said, "We only have 3 aircraft with large tanks." And he said, "Well, we've got to find some more." So one of the maintenance officers with some crewmen and a 6-by truck left the base in Ramatelli and toward the Foggia depot area, and they found a train with tanks on it that was proceeding, that would have been delivered eventually to the unit, but they stopped the train, and supposedly, or the story goes that of course they had their sidearms. I don't know, they didn't have to use them, but they got tanks off of the train and trucked them back, and with the crewmen working hard, dropping the smaller tanks, they had the aircraft available and refueled with the larger tanks by takeoff time that morning. And it's happenstance sometimes how things happen or come about. The 332nd had the penetration escort of the bombers to Berlin, but the group that was to relieve them missed the timing, and so the 332nd remained with the bombers on over Berlin. And in fact, they shot down 3 of those Me-262s that were shot down that day. And again, you heard that the advantage of doing that with the piston-driven P-51 was altitude and speed, and of course that was a new aircraft, and they hadn't developed combat tactics to the point of take advantage of their speed, and so that took place. So altogether, between the 12th and 15th Air Force missions, as I say, there were over 1,500 missions and over 15,000 sorties flown by the 99th and the 332nd Fighter Group combined, and destroyed over 100 aircraft, damaged a great number. That was in the air. We also had occasional fighter sweeps because we did limit Germany's war-making potential, and many times they did not have the fuel to put aircraft in the air, and we were able to destroy more than 150 and damage many equal number on the ground in those fighter sweeps. But that gives you a capsule of the experience of the 4 fighter squadrons that came out of the so-called Tuskegee experience, but we'll talk more about that tomorrow. And if we may, if you want to know what happened to me, I can ask them if they'll show that short clip of the elder statesman.
We'll do that at the end, if that's okay.
Certainly.
Well, Colonel McGee. One of the reasons that I enjoy doing what I do for a living is that I get to meet exceptional people, people who frequently inspire me. The man that just spoke at no point talked about himself very much. He talked in terms of we, in terms of the squadron and the group. And I certainly think that that's something that's worthy of admiration. But I would like, Colonel McGee, for you to answer this question, sir. In 1947, the United States Air Force became its own separate branch of service, and you remained in the Air Force. How long did you remain in the Air Force, and how many wars did you fly in?
Oh, you don't volunteer, I guess. You're around. I remained in the service for 30 years, and happened to be around when the Korean War picked out, and being a P-51 pilot, they grabbed us up right quick because we didn't have our jets in place to support that United Nations effort. So I flew, well, I'd flown 136 missions in Europe, and I flew 100 in Korea. And I'm still around a little bit later as we formed a new tactical reconnaissance squadron. So I'm on board to fly 172 missions in Vietnam.
Excuse my candor, but that's a hell of a lot of combat flying right there.
Was a lot out.
Well, last but not least, we would now like to hear from Shinji Abe about his experiences as a Japanese naval bomber pilot in World War II. Abe-san.
About the air power. On December 9th, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor attack, Imperial Japanese Navy sank 2 British battleships off Prince of Wales and repairs that England was proud of to be unsinkable battleships by air attacker. These 2 sea battles in Hawaii and Marie proved the traditional big ship, big gunnism was begun and air power took place at the main halls. It was a surprise that Japan, a poor country, engaged in these 2 sea battles, and Japanese Navy of only 70 years career did. I would like to remember several points how U.S. and Japanese Navy respectively took a positive stand on this point seriously. and made use of this fundamental philosophy in reinforcing and or investing their armaments. One of them, America, strove to construct aircraft carriers and produce aircraft making the best use of their excellent technical developments and huge industrial production ability. As a result, U.S. had only 3 aircraft carriers in 1941. But Admiral Halliday, whom we confronted in Mariana Sea Battle in June 1944, was leading a task force with 15 regular aircraft carriers carrying 930 aircraft in total. On the other hand, Ozawa fleet was leading 9 aircraft carriers, including remodeled aircraft carriers from the merchant ship and small old-style aircraft carrier carrying 420 aircraft in total. In this connection, when we look at the type of aircraft, half of American aircraft were fighter planes for defense. On the other hand, 2/3 of Japanese aircraft were for offense. We can tell a slight difference between U.S. and the Japanese Navy's strategic thought on this point. Second point, if the immediate purpose of the Pearl Harbor attack was to gain time to secure natural resources in Southeast Asia, Japan did not have to let Nagumo force stick there for the first 3 months in the following year, 1942, as Japan had achieved its purpose efficiently by the previous attack. Japan ought to advance toward the east and attack Hornets, Enterprise, and Lexington. That Japan missed to think and prevent recovery of U.S. Navy's air power as U.S. aircraft carriers were attacking Japanese naval bases scattered in Middle Pacific Ocean, including Marshall, one by one since January 1942. Third point, midway operation was not thoroughly studied beforehand. New aircraft carrier Shokaku and Zuikaku were damaged at the Coral Sea and the Solomon Sea battle in May 1942, and they were not able to participate in Midway operation. Moreover, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been participated in operation in Southeast Asia and toward the Indian Ocean for more than 3 months from the beginning of the year. And it was end of April when these ships returned home. Naturally, they needed repair and supplies, recruit and trained crew members. But there was no enough time. Why Japanese Navy had to occupy Midway under these circumstances in a hurry? I believe that the Midway operation was driven by Admiral Yamamoto's devotion to the emperor and his regret for having allowed Dorit raid on Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and other main cities in Japanese mainland on April 18th. Could we remove our fear to be laid again our land if Japan had occupied Midway, Ats, and Kisuka in addition? The answer is no. The Pacific Ocean is vast. Even if Japan could have occupied those places briefly, Japan had no ability to maintain the occupation so long. Anyhow, on May 27, 1942, Nagumo Task Force with 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, as core, left Japan toward east, and some 300 miles behind, Admiral Yamamoto on board Dreadnought Yamato, spearheading toward east with 7 battleships and escorting aircraft carriers as the main force. Cruising speed of Japanese warships was 12 knots at that time. I would like, it would take 12 hours and a half to reach where Nagumo force was fighting in 300 miles ahead. Even they speeded up in double to 24 knots. Nagumo's enemy was 250 miles further. This fighting rate and advanced formation mean big ships big ganism has not moved away, and it was a piece of evidence that Japanese Navy was not concentrating and emphasizing on air power. Lastly, maybe you would say it's a silly thing, like counting the age of dead baby. However, there is a saying, if you run after two hares, you will catch neither. I really cannot understand why a clever leader like Yamamoto Isoroku assigned Nagamo Force 2 missions, attack Midway Island and sink American aircraft carriers. Midway Island won't sink. Even some 10,000 of bombs were released. If we wanted to smash facilities and aircraft on land, we could have done it by firing guns or battleships. As there were more than 10 battleships the Japanese sent for Midway operation, we might have had quite a different result if Yamamoto had concentrated air power there and command Nagamo Force only to attack American aircraft carriers. Imperial Japanese Navy was suffered terrible defeat. Midway operation in June 1942 as a turning point. Japanese Navy rapidly tumbled down to defeat. As Yamamoto Isoroku reported to Prime Minister Konoe in February 1941, he tried his utmost to fight, but only for half a year. Thank you very much indeed for listening.
どうもありがとう、安倍さん. It's an interesting turn of events that you can have so many years later, American pilots, a German pilot and a Japanese pilot on the same stage. And so I think we're all fortunate to have chosen to have been a part of this session today. We've gone over time, but you know what? To heck with it, because we had a good time, I think. And may I have one last round of applause for our panelists. Richard Candelaria, Joachim Heine, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bourgeois, Colonel Charles McGee, and Zinji Abe.